Rasputin, even the name itself, sounds mysterious to foreign ears, if not even dangerous. And there is hardly any other figure in modern Russian history about whom so much speculation has taken place, and still does today, as about this itinerant preacher born in 1869 in western Siberia by the name of Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin. People have written books about him, sung about him, and even made crude, risque films. To his admirers, he was a saint with supernatural gifts. To his many enemies, the mad, sinister monk who had to be eliminated. It went so far that even before World War I even started, he was already accused of secretly being a spy in German service. So, what are the main points, the most prominent rumors and legends, fairy tales, and facts that still surround Rasputin's life to this day? Those of which contents have been so thoroughly mixed up in the past that in the end, no one could tell truth from lies anymore. Traditions refer to him as a so-called spiritual healer, and indeed, this man, who had already begun his pilgrimages at the age of 17, must have possessed inexplicable holiness, which eventually led him to the Tsar's court in 1903. There, as confirmed by numerous witnesses, Rasputin managed to temporarily heal the Tsarevich, Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, who was born in 1904 and suffered from the so-called blood disease. The title Tsarevich was always borne by the firstborn son of the Tsar and Tsarina, in this case, of the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, and his wife Alexandra Fyodorovna. There are numerous speculations about how Rasputin brought about the dramatic improvement in the child's health, especially after Alexei's accident in 1912 when he fell out of a rowboat. They range from miraculous and inexplicable spiritual healing abilities to healing through hypnosis and the elimination of stress factors. Or even simpler, did Rasputin control the bleeding by forbidding the administration of aspirin, which is now also known as a blood thinner? Anyway, his improvement in health, which was hardly explainable at the time, was attributed to Rasputin. To Alexei's mother, Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna, who was born in Darmstadt as the Grand Duchess, Hessian Princess Alex Victoria, Helene Louise Beatrix of Hesse, and by Rhine, it was made clear. The devout Tsarina, after her son's alarming health condition visibly improved almost overnight, saw Rasputin as a saint sent to her by God to protect the Tsarevich. Since then, she had rejected all criticism made of him, as did the Tsar himself, which, however, also led to numerous conspiracy theories against Rasputin and herself. But now it backfired that they had kept Alexei's hemophilia a secret from the public. And the public, which was highly interested in royal family stories, just like today, fueled by a press focused on sensation, scandal, and increasing circulation, could not understand how such a seemingly dark personality as this uneducated West Siberian monk could come and go in the Tsar's household, and, moreover, enjoy the special favor of the Tsarina. For the common people, it was clear that there must be something going on between the two. But Rasputin not only helped the Tsarevich, but, as there are numerous reports, also helped other people with their physical and emotional problems. Whether his healing abilities were due to the undoubtedly existing mystical powers, or simply to his compassionate nature, which, as we would say today, was a stress reliever, is a matter of opinion. In any case, he managed to secure the friendship of the Tsarist family. But this also led to high society, which was more and more sidelined at court because of him, to spread an increasing amount of rumors about him. At the same time, there developed a conspiracy, one that was ready to eliminate this man, who seemed dangerous to them, once and for all. A frequently relished and widely discussed topic in the city was the monk's supposedly unrestrained love life with so-called loose women. And the press provided eager officials who were waiting for such news, with descriptions of Rasputin's extravagant orgies with ladies of high society or the imperial court, and according to rumors, even with the empress herself. He was also rumored to be a member of the secret sect of the Klists, another fabrication, whose services supposedly always ended with an orgy. The fact was that Rasputin repeatedly made use of the services of ladies from certain establishments. But aside from the rumors spread by his enemies, there is not the slightest indication of a sexual relationship with the otherwise rather prudish Tsarina. For the Tsarina, Rasputin was a spiritual healer whom she trusted, but despite all her appreciation for his supposed healing powers, the uncouth peasant remained nothing more than a simple mujik, a serf whose healing abilities could only have come from God in the first place. The vast majority of the reports about Rasputin's lifestyle, which became even more exaggerated and embellished over time, were mostly based only on hearsay or rumors. However, these reports were spread by his numerous and influential opponents among the nobility and upper middle class not only to harm him, but also to discredit the royal family in order to justify certain political measures. In fact, the scandalous and sinister reputation attributed to Rasputin contributed to discrediting the Tsarist government and, after the murder of the entire Tsarist family by the Bolsheviks, and to even further accelerate the downfall of the Romanov dynasty. Another excessively embellished rumor was about Rasputin's, let's call it, sexual abilities. He was seen surrounded by numerous female admirers, including an impressive natural endowment of allegedly 34 centimeters. As proof of this, today in the St. Petersburg Erotic Museum, this informally dehydrated object can be marveled at, about which the following story is told. When Rasputin was killed in 1916, I'll get to the details in a moment, the main conspirator, Prince Felix Yusupov, is said to have amputated this anomaly, but then one of his servants, who was a secret follower of Rasputin, supposedly hid it and brought it to safety. Rasputin's daughter was Maria, who was born as Matrena and first performed as a variety dancer and then as a circus artist in the Bush Circus, also as a lion tamer with the American Hagenbeck Wallace Circus. She is said to have met a group of women in Paris in the 1920s who worshipped the attribute, which had made its way to the French capital by mysterious means during fertility rituals, and then passed it on to Maria. Later, however, Maria is said to have fallen into financial difficulties and sold the item to an antiques dealer. And the director of the Erotic Museum, Dr. Igor Knyazkin, swears on his life that he bought this item in the year 2000 in a wooden box from two French antiques dealers for $8,000 and exhibited it in his museum, where it has since been admired with reverence, especially by women. However, experts doubt the authenticity of the prop. Instead, the rumor persists to this day that the previous owner of this monster, preserved in formaldehyde, once stood in a field and either mooed or neighed. Another fantastic story is Rasputin's return from the realm of the dead after his murder on the night of the 29th to the 30th of December 1916, as it was told by his murderers. The main perpetrators were Prince Felix Yusupov, already mentioned in connection with the object exhibited in the Erotic Museum, and from one of the richest Russian families who, despite his homosexual inclination, was married to a niece of the Tsar. Then there was the Tsar's favorite nephew, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich Romanov, whose sexual relationship with Prince Yusupov began in the winter of 1912-1913. The far-right member of the State Duma, Vladimir Purishkevich, also caused a stir, as did Lieutenant of the Lifeguards Regiment, Sergei Mikhailovich Sukhotin. And finally, the Polish doctor. Other sources refer to him as a medical assistant in Russian service, the alleged Colonel Stanislaus Delazavert. The group, however, does not seem to have made a big secret of their plan. There were numerous people in the higher society of Petrograd who knew about it, including several members of the ruling Romanov-Holstein-Gottorp family, and also the Ohana, the secret police in Petrograd. It was known that an assassination attempt was imminent, as St. Petersburg was called, from 1914 to 1924. Rasputin was also warned by phone on the day of the assassination attempt to stay at home. In addition, his personal security had been further increased. But now Rasputin, who in fact had already hardly dared to leave his small apartment at 64 Gorokovaya Street, made a fatal mistake. He had accepted the invitation to the palace of Prince Yusupov, the man whom Rasputin still trusted, whom he had even called his friend. But not at all, for he had been the mastermind behind the assassination attempt on him. According to the later statements made by Yusupov, who, however, kept coming up with new versions over time, the act itself is said to have happened like this. In his palace on the Moika, where the other mentioned assassins were already waiting, the doctor Stanislaus Deluzvirt prepared several cakes with a dose of cyanide in this basement room, which, according to him, would have been enough to kill several men instantly. After Rasputin also poisoned the wine and rubbed the plate with cyanide, he picked up Rasputin at night by car, under the pretense of introducing him to two ladies at Yusupov's palace, who supposedly were interested in him. Once there, Rasputin was in high spirits, talking about his future plans, the impending success of the German weapons, and that the Tsar would soon return from the front to Petrograd. All the while, he ate the poison cake and drank plenty of the wine, but didn't show any signs of the poison having an effect. He only kept burping and mumbling a bit. But when they realized that Rasputin seemed to be immune even to highly poisonous cyanide, they became so unsettled that they decided Yusupov, who also liked to dress in women's clothes, should just go down to the cellar himself and shoot Rasputin. At 10:05 a.m. they supposedly then carried his body to the bank of the Little Nevka near the Petrovsky Bridge, broke the ice there, and threw him in. Even if we can't be sure what part of the story is true or made up, they really did sink the body in the river, which turned out to be a serious mistake. Because contrary to the assumption that the body would sink under the ice and be washed into the Gulf of Finland, it was discovered just 2 days later, which led to Professor Dmitry Kosorotov, a specialist in forensic criminology, performing an autopsy of the body in the pathology department of Chezmensky Hospital. After that, however, it was also clear that the melodramatic embellishment of the murder by Yusupov was nothing but fantasy, intended to portray him as the true savior of Russia from a dark power, and probably also to protect him from investigations for murder. Because, according to Professor Kosorotov, he found no traces of cyanide in Rasputin's body. Due to the massive pressure exerted on the Tsar by the Romanov-Holstein-Gottorp family, none of the assassins were punished. Basically, everyone was able to continue their previous life undisturbed. However, this had angered the peasants, who made up 2/3 of the population. And they blamed the unsolved murder of one of their own, mainly on the Tsar, while the nobility, apart from the Romanovs, had completely rejected him at the latest since Nicholas's legal inactivity. What had been remarkable about the whole affair, however, were the persistent rumors that Rasputin had been killed by an agent of the British Secret Service, And in fact, German agents in Stockholm had reported to Berlin that they got information from a reliable source that a young Englishman had been in the Yusupov house that night. And another secret message, which had been sent to the King of Bulgaria, had also mentioned a Briton. The meaning of all this is still unclear to this day. However, communications from the British ambassador to Russia, Sir George Buchanan, show that he too had heard of the plot shortly before the murder. And on December 18, which was 11 days before the crime, he wrote in a secret telegram, "We were informed about a week ago by a friend who is in close contact with some of the younger Grand Dukes that a number of young officers had sworn to kill him before the end of the year. However, there is nothing in the archives to indicate that Buchanan was involved in the murder. However, that does not rule out, and I will get to this in a moment, that other British nationals were involved." Which brings me to the crucial question, why? Did the hatred toward Rasputin become so great during World War I that he was murdered as a supposed enemy of Russia? In the end, was the accusation actually true that he was a German spy? These allegations had existed for a long time, actually, shortly after Rasputin made contact with the German-born Tsarina. It was even claimed and believed by many Russians that Rasputin, here with his wife, had been involved in espionage operations from Germany even before the First World War. And after the First World War broke out on August 1st, 1914, here you can see Rasputin with his children. It was actually said that he maintained a direct line to Germany, through which he passed on military secrets every day. All these rumors had created the impression among the public that the monk was a dangerous traitor spying for the German Empire, which would also explain the catastrophic situation of the Russian army at its fronts. In short, Rasputin was seen as the main culprit for the military disaster, while the ruling class of the all-possessing aristocracy was also convinced that the monk, whom they considered sinister, exerted a harmful influence on the Tsar and Tsarina, who were practically under his spell, which would endanger the monarchy. In contrast, the liberal middle class, the so-called intelligentsia, hated Rasputin for a completely different reason: jealousy, because, with his sometimes boorish peasant manner, he had achieved what they could only dream of, and what Tolstoy had already written about. The perfect peasant meets the perfect Tsar to build a bridge between the peasantry and the monarchy. But since there was neither the perfect peasant nor, moreover, Tsar Nikolai appeared politically weak and often indecisive, the intelligentsia had joined the conservative revolutionary forces to checkmate Rasputin together. In 1913, a year before the First World War, Rasputin intervened directly in Russian foreign policy for the first time. And he contradicted the supreme commander of the Russian armed forces during the First World War, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, who, in the course of Pan-Slavism, wanted to respond to Austria's 1908 annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina with war. The goal of Nikolaevich was first to destroy the German Empire, in order to, firstly, deprive the Austro-Hungarian Empire, here the war flag, of its powerful protector, and secondly, to wrest control over the Balkans. According to Nikolaevich, this would also create the conditions for the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, and the old Russian dream, the strait belonging to the Ottoman Empire, present-day Turkey, in the Mediterranean between the Aegean and the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, would finally and forever be under Russian control. As a saying among the high officer corps in St. Petersburg went, "The road to the Dardanelles leads through the Brandenburg Gate." But back to Rasputin. Frustrated by his lack of influence over the Tsar's political decisions, he had returned to his house in his hometown of Pokrovskoe in western Siberia. Then, on Sunday, the 28th June, 1914, the deadly assassination of the Austrian heir to the throne and his wife took place in Sarajevo. The photo shows the couple just minutes before. This event is considered one of the main triggers of the First World War. Rasputin had foreseen these developments and sent around 20 telegrams to the Tsar to warn him about the war with Germany, which greatly angered the Tsar, who saw it as interference in his political affairs. But before Rasputin would have had the opportunity to intervene in the so-called July Crisis, which led to the mutual declarations of war starting from the 1st of August, to personally exert a moderating influence on the Tsar, who was actually friendly toward Germany one day after the assassination in Sarajevo on the 29th of June 1914, the 33-year-old peasant woman Kian Jaguzeva attacked Rasputin in his hometown. He was stabbed with such a knife and so dangerously wounded in the intestines that it was considered a stroke of luck that he survived this attack. But after he left the hospital 6 weeks after the life-saving operation, he increasingly succumbed to alcohol and sometimes even drank himself into unconsciousness. And reports of sexual excesses also started circulating again. Meanwhile, during the war, the armies of the Central Powers inflicted heavy losses on the Imperial Russian forces under Grand Duke Nikolaevich over the next 12 months, which led Tsar Nicholas II to be seen on the left, dismissing his uncle to be seen on the right from the service. And on August 21, 1915, he personally took over the supreme command of the Russian army. But from now on, the embittered Nikolaevich plotted against the Tsar and Tsarina with all his means. His subversive work had been supported by the absence of the Tsar, who now spent most of his time at the headquarters in Mogilev. This meant that responsibility for domestic policy fell to the Tsarina, with Rasputin virtually acting as her advisor and even firing a minister at one point. As a result, new rumors had been spread, claiming that Rasputin and Tsarina Alexandra, leaders of a pro-German faction, were seeking a separate peace with the Central Powers in order to support the survival of the endangered autocracy in Russia. Here is one of the pamphlets in which the Tsarina admits her betrayal of Russia. But since the Tsar responded little or not at all to these accusations, and had also dismissed parliamentary warnings about Rasputin, the critics wanted to play it safe and eliminate the political monk in the fall of 1950, once and for all. After several assassination attempts had failed, their instigator, the far-right interior minister Alexei Kvostov, the main propagator of the legend that Rasputin was a dangerous German spy, had to resign on the 3rd March 1916. Days later, the Stock Exchange newspaper published a report detailing all the assassination attempts on Rasputin ordered by Kvostov, which was also picked up by many European newspapers and had severely discredited the government. But the French ambassador at the Tsar's court, Maurice Palaiolog, another German hater, also contributed his part with his reports to Paris, which were supposedly based on his own erotic fantasies about Rasputin. In Sarrazin, he gave a new one, which he had undertaken to conjure. In Kazan, on a bright June evening, he was drunk and left a brothel, driving a naked girl ahead of him, whipping her with his belt, which caused quite an unpleasant stir in the city. In Terbolgs, he seduced the very devout wife of an engineer, and so on. And now London also brought its intelligence service into the intrigues. Thus, a message became known that the British military intelligence, 5 liaison officer based in Petrograd, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hoare, had sent to the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service Military Intelligence, 6 in London, Mansfield Smith Cumming. In it, Hoare stated that he believed Rasputin was sabotaging Russia's war efforts and that his assassination would free the country from his sinister influence. He could say that because the far-right member of the State Duma, Vladimir Purishkevich, had informed him about the plot at the beginning of December. But what now? The florid reports of the French ambassador and the loud musings of the British agent about a helpful assassination resulted from British-French fears. Rasputin's influence on the weak-willed Tsar would lead to a separate peace with Germany, which would cause serious military problems, such as, for example, for the British troops fighting in France. Because this would have allowed the German Eastern Front troops to be transferred to the Western Front as early as 1916, which would have left the British outnumbered by the Allies and threatened their defeat. Because the United States of America had not yet actively entered the war, and it would take another 2 years before they deployed their troops to France. Regarding the actual involvement of Germany's wartime opponent Great Britain, Michael Smith writes in his 2010 book that even military intelligence, 6 officers in Russia, were instructed to arrange the assassination of Rasputin. And the former London police detective Richard Cullen, who examined the published MI6 files names in his book, also published in 2010 the 3 members who allegedly co-organized the murder in Petrograd, which were Captain John Scale, Lieutenant Oswald Rayner, and Captain Stephen Alley, who are said to have worked closely with the group around Prince Yusupov, and the leader of the monarchists in the Duma, Vladimir Purishkevich. How seriously the British agents viewed the domestic political developments in Russia was shown by the report of the aforementioned Captain John Scale. The German intrigues became more intense every day. Hostile agents were busy whispering about peace and suggesting how it could be achieved by causing disorder, unrest, and so on. Things looked very bleak. Romania was collapsing, and Russia itself seemed to be growing weaker. The failure of communication, the shortage of food, the sinister influence that seemed to be clogging the war machinery, Rasputin, the drunken debauchee who influenced Russian politics. What was to be the end of it all? Probably to relieve Scale. As for his involvement in the plot, on November 24, 1990, 5 weeks before Rasputin's murder, he was sent to then-neutral Romania, which, due to British-French territorial promises, had declared war on the Central Powers on August 27 to supposedly support the British intelligence operation there, to destroy the oil fields and ruin the corn harvest before the German troops marched in. However, the report by the aforementioned Richard Cullen states that Scale's deployment had a different reason. His daughter Muriel told him in an interview that her father was sent to Romania because he had to be outside of Russia at that time. The fact is, as also found in the records of Scale's driver, William Compton, that Scale met with Oswald Rayner and Felix Prince Josepho in Petrograd. And there are several books or documentaries that suggest or even claim that Scale, as Rayner's superior, ordered him to assassinate Rasputin himself. Whether those claims are true or merely speculation must remain open. However, there was also Oswald Rayner, the son of a clothmaker born in modest circumstances in 1988, who enrolled at Oriel College, University of Oxford in 1907 to study modern languages until 1910. He made the acquaintance of a young Russian student in 1909, Prince Felix Josepho, who studied fine arts at University College from 1909 to 1913. The two men had a close friendship, although it is not recorded how deep this friendship went. When Rayner was stationed in Petrograd as a British intelligence officer in November 1915, he regularly met with his old college friend, Prince Josepho, who also confirmed in his memoirs published in 1927 that he had told Rayner about the conspiracy. Rainer also helped the prince write his memoirs and arranged for the translation into English. Therefore, it cannot be completely ruled out that this pair shaped the whole story to suit their own interests. After Rainer died in 1961, his friends reported that he had told them he was in the prince's palace when Rasputin was murdered. And there are even indications that Rainer was not only at the scene of the crime, but also fired the fatal shot. But since shortly before his death, he burned all the papers in his possession and surely took 1 or 2 secrets to the grave, some things will have to remain in the dark. But Cullen knew about a letter to Scale, who was in Romania, which was dated to the 7th January 1917, and written by military intelligence. 6-officer Captain Stephen Alley, who was stationed in Petrograd, in which Cullen saw proof that he was indeed deeply involved in the assassination. Dear Scale, even though things here did not go exactly as planned, we have clearly achieved our goal. The reaction to the downfall of the Dark Powers was well received, although some uncomfortable questions about broader involvement have already been raised. Rainer is taking care of loose ends and will undoubtedly inform them about your return. But as everyone knows, letters and speculation are not yet definitive proof of British complicity. But what about the murder weapon or weapons? Determining the caliber or manufacturer of the murder weapon could provide clues about the perpetrator. This was not possible during the autopsy in 1916. But the British writer Giles Milton, who specializes in so-called narrative history, comes to the following conclusion after evaluating all available documents and images regarding Rasputin's murder. On the night of the murder, Yusupov was in possession of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich Romanov's Browning pistol, while Purishkevich had a Savage. Either of these weapons could have caused the wounds to Rasputin's liver and kidney, but the fatal gunshot wound to Rasputin's head was not caused by an automatic weapon. It could only have come from a revolver. Forensic and ballistics experts agreed that the weapon was almost certainly a .45 Webley revolver made in Great Britain, which was the favorite weapon of Oswald Rainer, who was a close friend of Yusupov, since the days when they both studied at Oxford University. There had been 2 studies by the British authors Andrew Cook and the aforementioned Richard Cullen, which also conclude that Rasputin must have been shot with a .455 caliber Webley revolver. Those results lead for both Cook and Cullen to the conclusion that it must have been an Englishman who killed Rasputin. But all these explanations, no matter how plausible they may be, are not suitable as evidence. I tried to confirm the legends about Rasputin that I described with facts, but I was not successful. Because there are certainly logical explanations for his healing abilities, although it also cannot be denied that this monk must have possessed mystical, inexplicable powers. His sexual escapades are also explainable and can be found today among much more famous personalities in history, sports, or the music world, without being considered particularly reprehensible. And with almost absolute certainty, he also did not have a liaison with the Tsarina. He was neither immune to a poisoning attempt, which, judging by the autopsy report, probably never even happened, nor was he bulletproof. After all, there isn't even the slightest indication that Rasputin had any connection with the German Secret Service or Colonel Nikolai. But the same applies to the Empress and other German members at the Tsar's court. However, the politically far-sighted monk had foreseen the possible consequences of the war, both for Russia and for the monarchy, and had urgently warned the Tsar against Russia entering the war. But he was unable to prevail against Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was seen here to the right of the Tsar in 1915 and who could not wait to march. Which is exactly what happened at the beginning of World War I in 1914, with the Russian so-called East Prussian Operation, as the Russian General Staff called the invasion of East Prussia. However, in that operation, the 8th German Army fought against two Russian armies, the 1st and 2nd, and from August 14th to the 15th. September 1914 at Tannenberg and at the Masurian Lakes, they were decisively defeated. On the 3rd January 1917, Rasputin was in the park of the Palace of Tsarskoye Selo, one of the residences of the Tsar, 24 kilometers south of Petrograd, only in the presence of the imperial family and some of their attendants. His family had not been invited. The Tsar had planned to build a church over Rasputin's grave. But shortly before his downfall on the 15th March 1917, Rasputin's mortal remains had been exhumed and burned so that his grave could not become a gathering place for supporters of the old regime. But for most Russians, Rasputin had already become immortal and remained unforgettable.